I want to share with you something that recently reached me from a listener named Valeria. She wrote to me late at night, and that alone told me something about the state she was in when she did. There are people who need to tell their story to someone before it weighs too heavily on them, and I think that was her case. If you also have something kept inside that no one has heard, write to me. There is always a place for that here. But now let me tell you what happened to Valeria when she returned to the town where she was born, to a house that had been closed for years, and discovered that some doors do not close even if you lock all the locks in the world. I did not want to go back. That is the first thing I need to say. Because if someone had asked me at any point in the 10 years prior if I would ever return to Noria Chica, the answer would have been no, a clear no. Without hesitation, without that pause that betrays doubt. Not because I had bad memories of the town exactly, but because I had built my life far away from there with a lot of effort, and childhood places have that ability to undo you if you let them. But my mother died in January, and the house was left alone. I am a nurse. I have been working night shifts in a city hospital for 6 years, and if there is one thing that job teaches you, it is to function under pressure, to keep your head when everything around you is falling apart. What happened to me in Noria Chica challenged all of that. And still, months later, there are nights when I wake up with the smell of that house in my nose and my heart racing as if something is chasing me. I arrived in March. The idea was to spend 2 weeks sorting through my mother's things, deciding what to do with the property, and returning to the city. A simple, concrete, executable plan. The kind of plan that works for me when emotions threaten to overflow. Noria Chica is a mountain village. One of those that remain stuck in time, not out of romanticism, but out of forgetfulness. About 200 people, a church, a store, dirt streets that turned to mud with every rain in March. My mother's house was at the end of the village, almost touching the boundary with the low hills that surrounded the valley. I arrived in the afternoon, when the sun was already quickly falling behind the hills, and the cold of the mountains sharpened the air. The key was with the neighbor across the street, a woman who had taken care of the house since my mother fell ill and went to the city hospital never to return. The woman was named Primitiva. She was about 70 years old, and looked at me when I arrived with an expression that I, who am used to reading faces of people who hide things, immediately identified as caution. It was not distrust towards me. It was something else. Something more like the way people look at someone who is about to enter a place where they know something is not right. She gave me the key, told me that if I needed anything, she was across the street, and before I turned around, she added in a low voice, "Don't light candles in the back room. I know your mother used to, but you shouldn't." I asked her why. She looked at me for a second, pressed her lips together and said, "Because you don't know what she knew." And she entered her house before I could ask her more. I stood on the dirt street with the key in my hand and the cold evening wind moving my hair, looking at the facade of my mother's house. It was a house like all the others in the village. Whitewashed adobe walls, small windows, a dark wooden door with iron fittings. Ordinary in every sense. I entered. The smell was the first thing. Every closed house has its own smell, a mix of time standing still and materials aging on their own. But the smell of this house had something more, something I took time to identify and finally recognized as copal. Resin incense, the kind that is burned in clay braziers. My mother always used it since I was a child, but I had associated it with her religious devotion, with the candles she placed on the altar of the main room, with that mix of Catholicism and popular custom that many women of her generation have. Now, with Primitiva's words still in his head, that familiar smell felt different. I walked through the house with the phone's flashlight because the electric light took a few minutes to respond. Kitchen, living room, 2 bedrooms, bathroom, everything covered in that light dust that accumulates when a house has been without human movement for months. The altar was still in the main room. Extinguished candle, image of St. Jude, a photograph of me as a child that surprised me to find there, a rosary rolled up on a dark stone that I didn't recognize, and at the end of the hallway, the closed door of the back room. That room had always been closed. As a child, when I lived there, I was forbidden to enter. My mother never explained to me why, and I accepted it with that instinctive obedience with which children accept rules they perceive as important. It wasn't a punishment room, nor a place where my mother kept valuable things. It was simply a closed room, and the closed door was enough of a signal. That night I didn't try to open it. I touched it with my fingers as I passed by, just that, and I noticed that the wood was cold in a way different from the rest of the house. Not the normal cold of an unheated room. something more concentrated, denser, like the cold you feel when you open a refrigerator. I settled into the master bedroom, warmed up some food I had brought from the city, and fell asleep early. Nothing happened the first night. Nothing happened the second night either. I spent the day organizing the kitchen, sorting clothes, taking bags to the village church where there was a lady who distributed donations. The physical work was good. It kept me grounded in what I could see, touch, and move. It was in the afternoon of the second day when I met Don Castulo. He was the oldest man in the village, or at least he looked like it. He arrived at the door of the house unannounced, wearing an old straw hat and an expression that was not exactly friendly, but not hostile either. It was the kind of face one sees on people who have decided that courtesy is fine, but honesty is better. He told me that he had known my mother since they were children, that they had grown up together in that town, and that when he learned I had come to close the house, he wanted to talk to me. I led him into the kitchen. I offered him coffee. He sat down with the slowness of someone whose bones have been working for many years and clasped his hands on the table before speaking. "Do you know what your mother kept in the back room?" he asked bluntly. "No, it was always closed." Don Castulo nodded as if that was what he expected. "Your mother was a good woman," he said. "But she carried something she didn't choose to carry. She inherited it, like certain things are inherited in certain families." He paused. "Do you know where your maternal grandmother came from?" "From some town around here, I think. I don't know the exact name." "From Carboneras." Don Castulo pronounced the name with a particular inflection, like someone naming a place they would rather not name. "In Carboneras there was a woman a long time ago who did something she shouldn't have. I'm not going to tell you what, because knowing it doesn't change anything. What I will tell you is that what he did stayed in the family. It passed to his daughter, and from his daughter to the next one, and so on until your mother." "What exactly stayed?" I asked. Don Castulo looked at me for a moment before answering. "A deal with something that doesn't have a decent name." He paused. "Your mother knew how to keep it under control. She knew what to do to keep it from leaving the room. She had been doing it for decades. But she's not here anymore, and the room has been unattended for months." I felt a coldness that wasn't from the air. "Attend to it how?" "Offerings. Certain herbs. Copal." Don Castulo opened his hands on the table as if explaining something that should be obvious. "There are things that sleep if you give them what they ask for, and there are things that wake up if left unattended for too long." I stayed silent for a moment, processing that with the part of my brain that has been a nurse for years and has a highly developed filter to separate what is real from what is altered perception or superstitious belief. But there was something about Don Castulo that didn't fit the profile of someone who is delusional or exaggerates. He was a straightforward man, without embellishments, who spoke about everything with the same factual matter as he might talk about the weather or the harvest. There was no drama in him, just information. "What's in that room?" I asked him. "I don't know for sure," he said. "I've never been in. No one has, except your mother and, before her, your grandmother. What I know is what I've seen from the outside over the years." He paused. "I've seen light under that door on nights when the house was empty. I've heard things. And I've seen your mother come out of that room with a face that wasn't the face of someone who had been doing something ordinary." That night, after Don Castulo left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the hallway door that led to the back of the house. From where I was, I couldn't see the door to the back room, but I could feel its direction, if that makes any sense. Like when you're in a room with someone you don't want to look at, but you know exactly where they are. I didn't open the door that night, but I didn't sleep well either. I woke up at 3:15 in the morning for no apparent reason, with that sudden clarity that sometimes interrupts deep sleep. The room was silent, the house was silent, and the village outside was in that particular silence of small towns at dawn, which is a different silence from the city, older, more complete. I stayed still, listening, and then I heard it. It was coming from the back of the house, from behind the closed door. It was a low sound, almost at the limit of what is audible, with that particular quality of sounds that you're not sure you're really hearing. A murmur, not exactly a voice, or maybe it was a voice, but processed through something that distorted it until it became almost unrecognizable. It had a rhythm. That was what disturbed me the most, that it wasn't random. It was repetitive, rhythmic, as if someone were reciting something over and over in a very low voice. I sat on the bed and listened for several minutes. The murmuring did not stop. I picked up the phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked down the hallway until I stood in front of the back room door. There, up close, the sound was clearer. Definitely a voice, or something imitating a voice. And beneath the sound, something else. A smell. Faint but unmistakable. Sulfur and something sweet on top, like rotting flowers. I placed my hand on the doorknob, and at that moment, the sound stopped. Absolute silence, suddenly, like when a recording cuts off. I stood frozen with my hand on the doorknob for what felt like several minutes, but was probably seconds. Then, very slowly, I withdrew it, and walked back to my room. I didn't open the door. The next morning, I called Renata, my co-worker at the hospital. I've known her since college. She's the person I trust the most. And she has that quality of listening without judging that is rarer than it should be. I told him everything over the phone. About Don Castulo, about Primitiva, what I had heard that night. Renata listened in silence and then said, "Did you open the room?" "No." "Good." A pause. "Valeria, I don't know what's in there, but listen. If your mother spent decades keeping that under control with certain rituals, and those rituals haven't been done for months, maybe it's not a good idea to open that door without knowing what you're doing." "Are you telling me to take witchcraft seriously?" I said, and there was a hint of nervous humor in my voice. "I'm telling you to take seriously the fact that something in that room makes noises in the early morning," Renata replied with her usual calm. "Call it whatever you want." I hung up and went to look for Don Castulo. I found him in his garden, working the land with that efficient slowness of old men who know their own rhythms. When he saw me coming, he stopped and waited, as if he knew I was coming with more questions. I told him what I had heard during the night. Don Castulo did not seem surprised. He nodded slowly, wiping his hands on his pants, and said, "He woke up. He has gone months without offerings and finally woke up. What should I do?" The old man looked at me for a moment. "There are two options. The first is to do what your mother did. Keep him, take care of him, continue the rite so he sleeps again." He paused. "The second is to seal it. There is a way to close that forever, but it requires entering the room. Do you know how?" "I know enough. I saw it done once many years ago, when your grandmother had to do it for the first time after receiving it from her mother." Don Castulo looked at me seriously. "But Valeria, you have to understand something before deciding. Entering that room without protection, without knowing what you are doing, is dangerous. What is there is not bad in the way people understand bad. It is ancient, and the ancient has its own rules." "What kind of protection?" "Copal first. Herbs, rue, rosemary, basil. A new white candle, unused. And this." He took something out of his shirt pocket that he held between his fingers. It was a small, dark seed tied with red thread. "Your mother gave it to me years ago to keep. She said that if anything happened to her and someone from her family came to close the house, I should give it to them." I kept looking at that small seed in Don Castulo's rough hand. "She knew I would come." "I think so." The old man placed it in my palm. "I think she planned it, in her own way. That afternoon I got the herbs. Primitiva gave me the copal without questions, with that expression of someone who knows more than they say and who chose long ago not to say it. She also gave me, without me asking, some handwritten sheets that I immediately recognized as my mother's handwriting. They were instructions. I read them 3 times sitting in the kitchen, with the afternoon falling outside and the house in silence. My mother's handwriting was small and tight, the handwriting of someone who writes quickly because they have a lot to say and doesn't trust they have enough time. The instructions were specific and methodical, the kind of instructions written by a practical person, not someone given to mysticism. They said, how to light the copal, in what order to place the herbs, what words to say upon entering the room, how to use the seed and the red thread to seal what was inside, and at the end, in an even tighter handwriting, as if she had hesitated before adding it, do not look at it directly, no matter what it does or says. Do not look at it. That night I waited for it to be midnight. I know it sounds like something someone would do in a movie, waiting until midnight to confront something supernatural. But my mother's instructions said that the rite should be performed when the day was at its darkest point, and midnight was that. I didn't question it. I had stopped questioning many things since the night before. I prepared everything in the kitchen, the clay brazier I found on a high shelf, the copal, the herbs, the white candle. The seed with the red thread. I arranged everything on a tray and took it to the hallway. I stood in front of the backroom door with the tray in my hands and my heart pounding harder than I would have liked to admit. No sound came from the other side of the door. Complete silence. I lit the copal first, as the instructions said. The smoke rose white and thick, with that resinous and dense smell that filled the hallway in seconds. Then the candle, then the herbs, one by one, holding them over the smoke of the copal until the smell of all of them mixed. And then I said the words my mother had written. I'm not going to repeat them here. Not because I'm afraid someone will use them, but because there are things that belong to certain moments, and taking them out of that context turns them into something else. What I will say is that they were simple, direct words, without the drama one would expect. Almost more like a negotiation than a spell. And as I said them, with the copal smoking and the candle lit and the herbs in hand, I took the doorknob and opened the door to the back room. The cold hit me first. Not the cold of winter in the mountains, but something different. That specific cold I had felt when I touched the door 2 nights before, concentrated and dense. The room was small, smaller than I remembered from childhood, although I had never entered it back then. I had a small window with the shutters closed, the floor made of packed earth, and in the center a circle drawn on the ground with something dark, inside of which there was a pile of objects that I couldn't identify well in the candlelight. Stones, feathers, something that looked like bone, bindings of dry herbs, and in the corner, in the darkest part of the room, there was something. I remembered what my mother had written. Don't look at it directly. I kept my gaze on the circle on the ground. I saw, out of the corner of my eye, that there was a shape in the corner. I'm not going to describe that shape because honestly, I couldn't do it accurately. What I can say is that it had a quality of something that has been in a space for a long time, that has taken on the shape of that space, that is almost part of it. I felt it looking at me. I didn't look at it. I entered the room. 3 steps to the edge of the circle. I carefully placed the tray on the ground, and I followed the rest of the instructions. The herbs inside the circle, the copal in the center, the specific words that corresponded to that moment. And finally, the seed. The instructions said that the seed with the red thread should be placed at the point of the circle that faced the door, the point of entry, and that while doing so, I should say the name of the one who had initiated the deal. My mother had written that name at the end of the page, Remedios. My great-great-grandmother, a woman from Carboneras who had done something she shouldn't have, as Don Castulo had said, and that had left that in the family. I said the name. What happened next is the hardest to describe. The silence changed in quality. That's the best way I have to explain it. There was no sound, no visible movement, but something in the atmosphere of the room shifted, like when the air pressure changes before a storm. And in the corner, where the shape that I wasn't looking at directly was, I felt something compressing, condensing, becoming smaller, and then nothing. The cold receded, not suddenly, but gradually, like when a cold room warms up with heating. The smell of sulfur and rotting flowers disappeared, replaced only by the copal. I knelt next to the circle with the candle in hand for several minutes, without moving, making sure that what I felt was real and not just what I wanted to feel. Then I got up, took the empty tray, walked backward to the door without turning my back on the room, and stepped out into the hallway. I closed the door. I sat on the floor of the hallway with my back against the wall and my legs bent, and I breathed, long and slow. The type of breathing one learns in the hospital when they need to refocus. Once, twice, 3 times. The hallway was silent. The house was silent. That night, I slept without waking up. The next morning, I went to see Don Castulo and told him what I had done. He listened to me until the end, with that calmness of his that few things disturb at his age. And when I finished, he nodded. "Do you think it worked?" I asked him. "How do you feel?" he replied. I thought for a moment. "I feel like the house is different, lighter, if that makes sense." "It makes all the sense." He paused. "What your mother kept under control for decades and what you sealed tonight are things that weigh. They literally weigh, in the air, in the space. When they go away, the difference is noticeable." "Did it go away completely?" I asked. Don Castulo hesitated for a moment before answering, and that hesitation told me more than any direct answer. "What is well sealed doesn't disappear," he finally said. It stays, but contained. Your mother contained it with offerings, which is a way of coexisting with that. You sealed it, which is different. He looked at me. But you put the seal, being the first in your family to do so without having received it directly. That has its particularities. What particularities? That the seal lasts as long as the one who put it lives. Don Castulo looked at me straightforwardly. As long as you live, Valeria, it remains sealed. I stayed silent, processing that. And when I die, someone from your family will have to know, or the room will have to be closed in another way. A pause. But that is not a problem for today. I finished organizing my mother's things in the following days. I left the back room locked, the tray with the brazier inside, the circle on the floor intact. I didn't go in again. On the last day before I left, I went to say goodbye to Don Castulo. He told me to take care of myself, that old dealings sometimes have memory, and that if at any moment I felt something I shouldn't feel, not to ignore it. I promised him I wouldn't. And to Primitiva, the neighbor across the street, who was waiting for me at the door of her house when I passed by with my suitcase. I returned the keys to the house, and she took them without saying anything. But as I was leaving, she called me. Valeria. I turned around. She looked at me for a moment with that expression of hers, watchful and calculating. Your mother was a good woman, she said. And you did well. She didn't say anything else. She went into her house. I returned to the city. I went back to the hospital, to the night shifts, to the illuminated hallways, and the smell of disinfectant, and the routine I had built with so much effort. Ordinary life resumed its rhythm. But there are nights, especially winter nights when the cold has a certain particular density, when I wake up and listen to the silence of my apartment, searching for something that I don't exactly know what it is. A whisper, perhaps. A smell that shouldn't be there. So far, nothing. So far. That was all Valeria wanted to tell me. She said that writing it was a way to put it in order, to see if by putting it into words it lost some of the weight she had carried since then. I don't know if she succeeded, but I am grateful that she shared it. If this story reached you in some way, leave me a comment. And if you too carry something that you haven't been able to tell anyone, you know that there is a space for that here. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. I received this testimony just a few days ago, and, honestly, it took me a while to decide whether to narrate it. Not because I doubted the person who sent it to me, but because there are certain details in this story that I found disturbing in a way that is hard to explain. It was shared with me by Valentina, a follower of the channel who lives in Colombia, and who, until last year, described herself as someone completely skeptical of everything supernatural. If you also have an experience that has marked you and want me to share it here, leave it in the comments or write to me directly. I take the time to read everything that comes in. Now get comfortable, close your eyes if you want, and listen to what happened to Valentina the night she decided to spend the weekend at her uncle's house, in a town whose exact name she preferred not to reveal. I didn't believe in any of that. I need to make it clear from the beginning, because if not, nothing I'm going to tell has the weight it deserves. I was one of those people who laughed when someone mentioned witches, goblins, or pacts with the devil. It seemed to me like beautiful folklore, part of the cultural identity of the towns, something that was told around the fire to entertain children or to explain what people did not understand before science existed. I was not afraid of the dark. I did not believe in the afterlife. I did not cross myself when passing in front of a church, nor did I have any special respect for cemeteries. She was a graphic designer. She lived in a small apartment in the city, had an orderly and rational routine, and when my friends invited me to those Ouija or tarot sessions that come into fashion from time to time, I went for the joke, not out of conviction. All that changed in October of last year. Not suddenly, but in a way that built up slowly, like water rising without you noticing until your feet are already wet. My uncle Ernesto called me at the end of September to invite me to spend a weekend at his house. Ernesto was my mom's younger brother, a quiet man who had retired young from urban life and had gone to live in a small town where he had a house inherited from my grandparents. It was a small town, one of those that only appear on maps if you know how to look for them. with a central square, a colonial church, and a population of no more than 2,000 people. Ernesto cultivated a garden, had chickens and 2 dogs, and was the most drama-free person I knew. He invited me because it had been months since we last saw each other, and because, according to him, he needed someone to help him go through some old papers he had found in the attic of the house. I accepted without thinking twice. I needed to get out of the city. I needed clean air, and the idea of spending 2 days in a quiet village organizing old papers sounded almost romantic to me. I left on a Friday afternoon and arrived around 7 in the evening, when it was already dark and the mountain chill had settled over the cobblestone streets with that particular density that the cold of high villages has. A cold that not only seeps through the clothes but also gets into the bones and thoughts. Ernesto's house was large for a village, with thick walls and high ceilings featuring an interior corridor filled with plants and a wood stove kitchen that smelled of eucalyptus and freshly brewed coffee. He welcomed me with a long hug and prepared a simple dinner while telling me about his chickens and the changes he had made in the garden. It was exactly what I needed. Conversation without urgency, without screens, without notifications. I went to bed early, in the room that had been my mother's when she was a child, with a solid wood bed and a wool mattress that smelled of time standing still. I slept well that first night. Deeply even. I don't remember dreaming anything. On Saturday, we spent the time going through the attic. It was a space under the roof, accessible by a wooden staircase that creaked with every step, filled with boxes, old furniture covered with sheets, leather trunks, and an impressive amount of papers, letters, receipts, property documents, black and white photographs. We spent hours up there, sorting, commenting, laughing at some old photos of relatives we had never known. It was pleasant work, the kind that connects you to your own history in an unexpected way. It was during that afternoon that I found the box. It was a small box, made of dark wood, without a label or decoration. It was at the back of a trunk, beneath yellowed letters and a couple of old accounting books. It was dense for its size, as if there was something compact and heavy inside. I tried to open it but couldn't. It had a rusty metal clasp that wouldn't budge. I asked Ernesto what it was, and he looked at it with an expression I couldn't interpret at that moment, a mix of recognition and something akin to discomfort. "That box belonged to my mom," he said, and he didn't add anything else. I set it aside and didn't press further. My grandmother had died when I was 5, and I barely remembered her. Ernesto didn't talk about the subject for the rest of the afternoon, and I forgot about the box as quickly as someone who doesn't find importance in things. That night after dinner, Ernesto told me he was going to step out for a moment to visit a neighbor who was sick and that he wouldn't be long. I stayed in the living room, with a book in my hands and the sound of the fire in the fireplace completely calm. It was when I was alone that what I don't know how to call anything other than the beginning started. First, it was the smell. A smell of wet earth, of something vegetal and decomposed, that appeared for no reason in the center of the living room. It didn't come from the fireplace, it didn't come from the plants in the hallway. It was a smell that was simply there with no apparent origin, and that disappeared as quickly as it came in less than a minute. I attributed it to the humidity of the old house. I continued reading. Then came the sound. A very soft sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the ceiling. It wasn't the normal creaking of a structure settling with the cold of the night. It was rhythmic, measured, like very small and very slow footsteps walking on the floorboards of the attic. I placed the book on my lap and listened. The sound continued for maybe 20 or 30 seconds, and then it stopped. I saw nothing. There was nothing to see. But I felt something that I later recognized, in retrospect, as the first crack in my skepticism, an inexplicable discomfort, a feeling that the room I was sitting in was a little smaller than before, as if something invisible had entered and taken up space. Ernesto returned half an hour later, and I didn't mention anything to him. It seemed ridiculous to do so. That night it took me longer to fall asleep. Not because I was exactly scared, but because something in the atmosphere of the house felt different, charged, like when the sky turns that metallic gray color before a strong storm and the air smells of electricity. I finally fell asleep, past midnight. And then I dreamed of my grandmother. Or at least, I assumed it was her. She was an old woman with white hair tied up, sitting in a wooden chair in a room I didn't recognize. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with an expression that was not exactly sadness or joy, but something I don't have a name for to describe. It conveyed urgency, that much was clear. A silent urgency, as if she were trying to tell me something without being able to speak. When I woke up at 3:15 in the morning according to my phone's clock, I had the very clear and very disturbing feeling that the dream hadn't been exactly a dream. I stayed still in bed, listening to the house. Everything was silent. The cold was more intense than the night before, and I could see my own breath in the darkness of the room. It was then that I noticed that the door to the room, which I had closed before going to bed, was ajar. Just a few centimeters, but it was open. I tried to think of a logical explanation. Old doors move on their own. Humidity makes the wood work. There are drafts in old houses. I convinced myself quite successfully and went back to sleep. The next morning, while we were having breakfast, Ernesto asked me if I had slept well. I told him yes, more or less, that I had had a strange dream. I described the old woman sitting in the chair. Ernesto put the coffee cup down on the table and looked at me for a moment that lasted too long. "Did she have her white hair tied up?" he asked. "Yes." "Sitting in a dark wooden chair?" I stiffened. "Yes, Ernesto. What's wrong?" He didn't respond immediately. He got up, went to the hallway, and returned with a framed photo that I had never seen before. He placed it on the table. It was a black and white photo of an older woman, sitting exactly as I had seen her in the dream. White hair tied up, dark wooden chair. That same expression that was neither sadness nor joy, but something nameless. "That's your grandmother," Ernesto said. "That's how she was sitting the day before she died." I didn't know what to say. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to find a rational explanation, that I had seen that photo as a child and had stored it in some corner of my unconscious, that the brain constructs images in dreams from scattered fragments. I half convinced myself enough to continue with breakfast, but the crack I had felt the night before had grown a little bigger. That Sunday was the last day I would spend in the village. Ernesto had a commitment in the afternoon, and I was thinking of leaving early, before it got dark. I decided to go for a walk around the village while he took care of his things, and it was during that walk that I met the person who, looking back, changed everything that would come after. I had stopped in front of the church looking at the carvings on the facade when an elderly woman approached me. She was small, hunched over, wearing a dark poncho that almost completely covered her, and had the most penetrating eyes I have ever seen in my life. Two dark points that seemed to look not at me but inside me. She asked if I was Ernesto's niece. I said yes. She introduced herself as Doña Perpetua. "I knew you found the box," she said without further ado. I was frozen. I hadn't mentioned the box to anyone but Ernesto, and it was impossible for her to know unless he had told her, which seemed unlikely given how little he had talked about it. "How do you know that?" I asked. "I have been waiting for someone from that family to find it," she replied. "The box shouldn't still be there. What is inside shouldn't remain unresolved." I wanted to ask her what was inside, but something in her tone stopped me. There was a seriousness in the way she spoke that did not invite superficial curiosity, but rather careful listening. She asked me to follow her to her house, which was half a block from the church. I should have said no. In any other circumstance, I would have said no. But something, and I still don't know exactly what it was, made me follow her. Doña Perpetua's house was small and dark, filled with the dense and complex smell of medicinal plants. Rosemary, rue, purple basil, and others I couldn't identify, hanging in bundles from the beams of the ceiling. She made me sit in front of a small table and sat across from me. She looked at me for a long time without saying anything. "Your grandmother made a deal," she finally said. I didn't respond. I waited. A long time ago, when she was young and her family was going through a very bad time. A deal to make things better, and they got better. But deals of that kind have conditions. They always do. I asked her what kind of deal. Doña Perpetua was evasive about the details, and today, with the distance, I believe that evasion was deliberate. Not because she wanted to hide the truth from me, but because there are certain things that naming too directly has its own consequences. What she did tell me was that the box contained the elements of the pact, objects, materials, something written, and that as long as that box remained closed in that house, the debt was suspended, but not settled. "Suspended how?" I asked. "What was invoked is still there," she said. waiting. It does not act because the box contains it, but over time, the containment weakens, and something or someone has to resolve what your grandmother left unresolved. I asked her what it meant to resolve. She explained to me that there was a way to undo a pact of that kind, not by ignoring it, not by destroying the box, but by completing it in a specific way that involved certain steps that had to be taken with care and respect. She told me that she knew how to do it because she had learned from her own grandmother, who had been the one to teach your grandmother the wrong path she had taken. The wrong path? I repeated. Doña Perpetua nodded slowly. There are ways to ask for help that do not open doors that should not be opened. Your grandmother took the shortcut. The shortcut always has a price that someone ends up paying. I remained silent, processing all of that. A part of me, the rational part that had been the dominant part throughout my adult life, said it was folklore, that it was superstition, that I was talking to an old woman from the village who had built a narrative around an old box that probably contained dried herbs and unimportant papers. But another part, the part that had heard footsteps in the attic and had dreamed of my grandmother just as she appeared in a photograph I believed I had never seen, was not so sure. What should I do? I asked. Doña Perpetua looked at me with those eyes that saw inward. Tonight, before you leave, go back to the house and go up to the attic. Take the box. Do not open it. Bring it here. I will take care of the rest. I returned to Ernesto's house with my head in a constant state of noise. I didn't know what to believe. Ernesto wasn't there when I arrived. He had left for his engagement early. I was alone in the house with the sound of the wind outside and the memory of the footsteps I had heard the night before on the attic floorboards. I spent an hour trying to convince myself that I didn't have to do anything, that I could just gather my things, get in the car, and go back to the city, forgetting all that conversation as an interesting anecdote from the town. But I couldn't shake the image of my grandmother in the dream from my mind. That silent urgency that was neither sadness nor joy but something nameless. And the way Doña Perpetua had described the box to me without me having mentioned it. In the end, I went up to the attic. It was late afternoon, but it was already dark up there. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate through the covered furniture and stacked boxes until I reached the trunk where we had found the box the day before. The box was still there. I picked it up carefully, with both hands, and noticed it felt warmer than it should, considering the temperature in the attic was low. A warmth almost organic, as if it had something alive inside that radiated heat. I came down the attic stairs with the box in my hands, and it was on the last step when I placed my foot in the hallway on the second floor that I felt I was not alone. There is no precise way to describe that feeling. I saw nothing. I heard nothing. But there was something in the hallway between the attic stairs and the main staircase that led down to the first floor, that occupied space. Something I couldn't see but could perceive with a clarity that went beyond the five senses I know. A presence, dense and ancient, that was watching me with an attention that was nothing human. I stood frozen for what must have been 30 seconds but felt like much more. The box in my hands felt warmer. The hallway smelled of damp earth, the same smell I had sensed in the room the night before. Then, something changed. The presence, if that's what it was, became less dense, as if it were stepping back. And I took that moment to walk, not run, with firm steps, even though my legs were trembling, to the main staircase and from there to the street door. I went straight to Doña Perpetua's house. She opened the door for me before I could knock. She looked at me, looked at the box, and nodded with an expression of something I interpreted as relief mixed with something else I couldn't name. "Good," she said. "Come in." What happened in the following hour, in that small dark house filled with hanging plants, is something that I find very difficult to narrate accurately. Not because I don't remember it, but because there is a difference between remembering something and finding the exact words to convey it. I will try to do it the best way I can. Doña Perpetua placed the box on the table between the two of us. She took several items from a shelf. A white candle, a small clay container, something that looked like dirt or dark powder, and a paper folded several times that she placed under the box without explaining to me what it was. She lit the candle. Then she asked me to place both hands flat on the box and not to move them until she told me to. She asked me if I believed. I told her I didn't know. She said it didn't matter whether I believed or not. What was important was that I respected the process. She began to speak in a low voice, in a Spanish mixed with words I did not recognize, words that sounded ancient, pre-literate, that did not belong to any language I could identify. It was neither a shout nor a dramatic invocation. It was something much more intimate and serious than all that, like a conversation with something that is not present in the usual sense of the term. The candle burned steadily for a while, and then the flame flickered, twice, in a way that did not correspond to any draft of air. Then, Doña Perpetua opened the box. The metallic closure that had seemed to me oxidized and immovable turned in his hands without resistance. I looked inside. There was a small bundle of human hair tied with a red thread, something that could have been a very small tooth, a folded piece of paper blackened at the edges, and a very small figure carved from dark wood that represented a human shape but with incorrect proportions, too long and thin, with the arms in a position that did not correspond to any natural posture. Doña Perpetua did not let me look for long. She took the contents of the box with steady hands and began to deposit them into the clay vessel, one by one. Then she added the dark powder. Then she folded the paper that had been underneath the box and placed it on top of everything. Finally, she brought the flame of the candle closer to the vessel, and the contents ignited with a speed I did not expect, with no excessive smoke, producing a clean and steady flame. As it burned, the smell changed. The scent of wet earth and decay that had been intermittently present since the night before completely disappeared, replaced by something cleaner, more neutral, like air after the rain. Doña Perpetua watched the fire until it went out on its own. Then she looked at me. "It's done," she said. She didn't explain further. She made me understand without saying it in exact words that it was better not to ask more questions, that there were things that didn't need to be understood intellectually to be real, and that excessive curiosity about certain matters was its own form of danger. I left that house with the empty box under my arm, which Doña Perpetua asked me to take back to the attic and leave it where I had found it. I did. This time the second-floor hallway was empty in a way different from how it had been empty before. It was not the emptiness that hides something, but simply the absence of anything other than walls, wood, and old dust. Ernesto arrived at 7 in the evening. I told him what had happened while we were having dinner. He listened to me attentively, without interrupting, with that expression of someone who recognizes the shape of a story that he already knew had to be told someday. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. "Doña Perpetua has been waiting for decades for someone to do that," he said. "I never had the courage. I figured that as long as I didn't touch the box, nothing would happen." I asked him if he had perceived things in the house all those years. He took a moment to respond. "Sometimes," he said. "Nothing dramatic. Just a feeling that something was waiting, like living next to something asleep that you know shouldn't be there." I left the town that night shortly after 8. The drive back to the city was quiet, with the darkness of the mountains outside the car windows and the rain that had started to fall while I was saying goodbye to Ernesto. I didn't feel anything strange during the return. The tranquility that accompanied me during that journey was different from the indifference I used to call tranquility before that weekend. It was something more conscious, more acquired, like the calm of someone who has just passed close to something big without having been touched by it. I arrived at my city apartment past midnight. I went straight to bed and slept soundly until 9 in the morning on Monday without dreams, or at least without dreams that I remembered. Weeks went by, and I began to integrate what I had lived in the way we integrate things that don't perfectly fit into the order we have imposed on the world, not by ignoring them, but by slightly rearranging the order so that they fit. I continued with my life, with my work, with my routine. But something had changed in the way I listened to spaces. I began to perceive subtle differences in the quality of silence in places, in the weight of the air in certain rooms, in that invisible temperature that some houses' atmospheres have, which I would have previously attributed simply to the architecture or the condition of the walls. I don't know exactly what I found in that house. I don't know exactly what was in that box, nor what kind of deal my grandmother made decades earlier, nor what exactly Doña Perpetua did to resolve what remained unresolved. I also don't know if what I perceived in the hallway on the second floor was what the box contained or something different, something that lived in that house as a consequence of years of an unresolved presence. What I do know is that on the night of my birthday, 3 weeks after that weekend, I dreamed again of my grandmother. This time she wasn't sitting in the chair with that silent urgency. She was standing in a space with no recognizable walls or ceiling, with an expression that this time I could interpret. Something akin to the peace that people have when they finish doing a difficult thing they had pending for a long time. She didn't say anything in that dream. She just looked at me. When I woke up, the room smelled very softly of something that took me a few moments to identify. The scent of the plants from my Uncle Ernesto's kitchen, the rosemary and rue and basil that my grandmother had grown, as my mom had told me years ago. The smell disappeared in a few minutes. I didn't perceive it again. And with that, I think the story ends. Or it ends the part that I can tell, which is not necessarily the same. I called Ernesto a few days later. He told me that the feeling in the house had changed, that the hallway with the plants felt brighter, even though the windows were the same, that the dogs, who used to avoid certain corners of the house for no apparent reason, now roamed the entire property without any restrictions. I went to visit Doña Perpetua a month later, when I had the chance to return to the village. She told me that she was feeling well and that she had waited a long time to be able to do what she did, that some things need someone of the same blood for the closure to be complete, and that I had arrived at the precise moment. I asked her if I was in danger now. She replied that I was not, that what had been invoked no longer had a reason to stay, that pacts, when resolved with respect, leave no wounds, only memory. I don't know if I can fully believe him, but since that October, I am a different person than I was before. Not in the dramatic sense of someone who has seen the world break and rebuild, but in the quieter and more real sense of someone who has understood that the world has more layers than they believed, and that rationality, while still my main tool for navigating everyday life, does not explain everything. There are things that wait. There are debts that are inherited without anyone warning you. And there are people in small towns who have been holding on to the way to close what others left open for decades, patiently waiting for someone of the right blood to come and knock on a door they didn't know they were looking for. That is what happened to Valentina. That is what she told me with calm and precise words, without embellishments or exaggerations, like someone who has already processed what they lived and now simply offers it for others to listen to. And so ends Valentina's testimony. She wrote to me at the end of her message that she doesn't expect anyone to believe her, that not even she would have believed such a story before living it. But she felt she had to tell it, even if it was just so that someone else would know that sometimes what we inherit from our family is not just physical traits or memories, but also unresolved issues with things that don't have a clear name. If something similar has happened to you that you don't know how to explain, I would like to hear it. You can leave it in the comments or send it to me directly. There is space here for all the stories that deserve to be told. Take care, and we'll talk soon. This experience was sent to me by a follower named Andres, who spent 3 summers working as a night caretaker in a pre-Columbian art museum in Lima, Peru. What he discovered about one of the pieces in the collection and the visits he received after closing led him to abruptly leave the job without giving explanations. If you have ever worked alone in museums, galleries, or archives at night and felt that ancient pieces have something more than historical value, tell me in the comments. This is the story of Andres and the idol that should never have been unearthed. My name is Andres, and during 3 summers while studying archaeology at university, I worked as a night watchman at the Museum of Ancestral Cultures in Lima. It was a perfect job for me. I could study during the quiet hours, the pay was decent, and being surrounded by ancient artifacts fueled my passion for archaeology. The museum was small but prestigious, specializing in pre-Columbian pieces from cultures such as the Moche, Nazca, Chavin, and Inca. 3 floors of galleries filled with ceramics, textiles, gold tools, and the most impressive, a collection of stone idols dating back more than 2,000 years. My shift was from 11 at night to 7 in the morning. Basically, I walked through the museum every hour, checked that all the doors and windows were secure, monitored the security cameras, and the rest of the time I could read or study in the surveillance office. The first 2 summers were completely normal. The museum at night was quiet, a bit unsettling perhaps with all those ancient figures staring at you from their display cases, but nothing that a rationalist archaeology student like me couldn't handle. Everything changed the 3rd summer when they brought in the new acquisition. It was a stone idol from the Chavin culture, found in a recent excavation in the northern mountains. It measured approximately 60 centimeters in height, carved from black volcanic stone. It represented a humanoid figure with feline features, almond-shaped eyes, prominent fangs, claws instead of hands. The Chavin were known for their art that blended humans with jaguars, snakes, and eagles. But this idol was different. There was something in its expression, in the way its carved eyes seemed to follow you no matter where you looked at it from. And unlike other pieces in the museum that emanated a sense of history and antiquity, this idol emanated something more. Something that made your skin crawl when you got too close. Dr. Vargas, the museum director, was excited about the acquisition. He called me to see it before it was installed in its display case on the third floor. "It's exceptional, Andres," he said, his eyes shining with academic enthusiasm. "Archaeologists believe it was a central idol of worship. Look at these marks on the base. They are stains of what was probably blood, preserved by the mineral composition of the stone. They made sacrifices in front of this idol." I approached to examine the stains. They were a dark reddish-brown, deeply embedded in the porous stone. Many stains, layers upon layers, suggesting decades or centuries of rituals. "What kind of sacrifices?" I asked. "The Chavin mainly sacrificed llamas and guinea pigs," Dr. Vargas replied. "But there is evidence that in special rituals, particularly in times of crisis like droughts or wars, they also made human sacrifices." I looked into the eyes of the idol. They seemed hungry. "When will you install it?" I asked. "Tomorrow. It will occupy the central place in the Chavin Gallery on the third floor. It's going to attract many visitors once we announce its acquisition." That night, the idol remained in the preparation room in the basement, waiting to be cleaned and cataloged before its exhibition. I made my usual rounds, but I found myself avoiding the basement. There was no logical reason for it, just a feeling that I preferred not to be near that thing more than necessary. Around 3 in the morning, while I was in the security office, I heard something on the camera monitors. A sound, low, rhythmic, almost like chanting. I checked the screens. Everything seemed normal. The galleries were empty, the showcases intact. But the sound continued, clearly picked up by the camera's microphones. I took my flashlight and my radio and began my verification round. The sound was louder on the third floor. It seemed to come from the Chavin Gallery, although that didn't make sense because the new idol had not yet been installed there. I entered the gallery. The other Chavin pieces were in their places, ceramics with jaguar designs, ancient textiles carefully preserved, copper tools, everything normal. But the chanting continued. And now that I was in the gallery, I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't coming from above. It was coming from below, from the basement. I went down the stairs to the preparation room in the basement. The door was closed as I had left it, but the chanting was definitely coming from inside. I opened the door slowly. The room was dark except for the emergency light above the door. The idol was where they had left it, on a work table in the center of the room. And around the table, barely visible in the dim light, there were figures. They were not solid. They were like three-dimensional shadows, human shapes without defined features. And they were kneeling around the idol, swaying, and the chant was coming from them. They were not words in any language I knew. They were guttural, rhythmic sounds that resonated at frequencies that made my teeth ache. I turned on the main light in the room. The figures disappeared instantly. The chant stopped. Only the idol remained, sitting innocently on its table, its stone eyes looking at me with what I swear was a hint of amusement. I convinced myself that I had been daydreaming, that the exhaustion from studying for my final exams was making me hallucinate. I closed the room and returned to the office, determined not to think about it anymore. But on the following nights, it happened again. The chant, the shadow figures, always around 3 in the morning, always in the basement near the idol. And after they installed the idol on the third floor in its specially designed glass case, the apparitions moved with it. Now the figures appeared in the Chavin Gallery, kneeling in front of the case, continuing their ancient ritual. I began to investigate. I searched the museum library for everything I could find about Chavin culture and its religious practices. What I discovered deeply unsettled me. The Chavin did not only worship their idols. They believed that the idols were inhabited by powerful spirits, entities that existed on a plane between the physical and the spiritual world. The Shavin priests acted as intermediaries, feeding these spirits with sacrifices and receiving in return power, knowledge, or favor. But there were warnings in the ancient texts. If an idol was not fed properly, if the rituals ceased, the spirit within would become hungry, restless, and it would begin to seek sustenance for itself. This particular idol had been unearthed from a temple that had been abruptly abandoned around the year 200 AD. The archaeologists did not know why the temple was abandoned. Theories included natural disasters, war, or social collapse. But the excavation records mentioned something strange. They had found skeletons in the temple, many skeletons, all in positions that suggested they had died during rituals. And all the skeletons showed signs of having died from violent causes not immediately before death, but over an extended period, as if they had been consumed slowly. One night, about 2 weeks after the idol was installed, the apparitions changed. The shadow figures no longer just knelt and sang. Now they moved through the museum. I saw them on the security cameras, gliding through the halls, examining other display cases, going up and down stairs, and they began to approach me. The first time someone approached me directly, I was on the second floor doing my rounds. I felt a sudden chill, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. I turned around and there it was, a shadowy figure less than a meter away. It had no face, but I could feel it watching me, studying me, evaluating me. I stepped back and stumbled into a display case. The figure moved closer, and then I heard a voice, not with my ears, but directly in my mind. The devourer is hungry. It hasn't fed in centuries. You could serve it. What? I managed to say out loud. Or you could serve in another way. Restore the rituals. Feed it properly. Become its priest in this new era. The figure extended what could be an arm towards me. I didn't want to know what would happen if it touched me. I ran. I ran down the stairs out of the building into the street. I stayed outside until dawn, trembling on a bench in a nearby park. I should have resigned that morning. But I was young, stupid, and proud. I thought I could handle this. That, as an archaeology student, I had to investigate this phenomenon, document it, understand it. So I went back the next night. The shadow figures were waiting for me. Dozens of them now, filling the museum. And they all moved with purpose, as if they were preparing something. I went straight to the Shavin gallery on the 3rd floor. The idol was in its display case, but something had changed. The bloodstains on its base looked darker, fresher, and the carved eyes had a sheen that hadn't been there before. "You've returned," said the voice in my mind. "Good. The devourer has chosen you. You can feel it, can't you? The pull, the call." And the worst part was that it was right. There was something about the idol that drew me in, like a magnet, pulling not my body but something deeper, my will, my soul. "What does it want from me?" I asked. "Renew the pact." The ancient priests fed the devourer and in return received power over life and death, visions of the future, knowledge of hidden secrets. You could have the same. What price? A sacrifice every new moon, blood for the devourer. At first, small animals. Eventually, greater offerings. "Human sacrifice," I said, feeling sick. "You're asking me to kill people." The devourer does not distinguish. Blood is blood. Life is life. And those who serve the devourer are generously rewarded. One of the shadow figures partially solidified, taking on a more defined shape. It was a man, or had been one long ago. He wore the ceremonial robes of a Shavin priest. His face was gaunt, his eyes deep hollow. "I served the devourer for 40 years, he said in a raspy voice. "I saw the future, controlled the harvests, healed diseases. The power was intoxicating. And now?" I asked. "What are you now?" "An eternal servant. When I died, my soul did not pass. It remains here bound to the devourer, fulfilling his will until he finds a successor to continue the pact." "How long have you waited?" 1,800 years. The number hit me. 1,800 years tied to this idol, waiting, serving, unable to find peace. "And what if I refuse?" I asked. The shadow figures moved closer. The air became heavy, hard to breathe. "The devourer is hungry," the dead priest repeated. "If you do not serve willingly, you will serve in another way, as food." I felt something pulling at me, not physically, but on a spiritual level, as if something were trying to tear my soul from my body. The pain was indescribable, like being ripped apart from the inside. I fell to my knees, struggling against the sensation, and in that moment of panic and agony, I remembered something I had read in one of the ancient texts about Chavin culture. The idols were powerful, yes, but their power came from belief, from worship, from sacrifices. Without these, they were just stone. And there was a way to break their dominion, deny their divinity, reject their power, assert that they were nothing more than objects carved by mortal hands. "No," I said, forcing the words through the pain. "You are not a god. You are not the devourer. You are just stone, a rock carved by dead humans long ago. You have no power over me." The pull intensified as if the entity were furious at my rejection. "You have no power," I repeated louder now. "You are nothing, and I do not fear you." The shadow figures began to scream, a sharp and terrible sound that filled the museum. The idol in its display case began to vibrate, the bloodstains on its base glowing with sickly red light. But I continued. "I do not recognize you. I do not worship you. I do not feed you. You are nothing to me." With each word, the pain diminished, the pull weakened, and the shadow figures began to fade, their forms becoming less substantial. The dead priest looked at me with what could have been desperation. "Please," he pleaded, "if I do not find a successor, I must serve forever. Please." But I stood firm. "I am not your successor, and your pact ends here." With one last cry of frustration and fury, the figures disappeared completely. The idol stopped vibrating. The red glow faded, and I was left alone in the gallery, trembling but free. I quit that morning. I didn't wait until the end of my shift. I simply left my keys and my ID on Dr. Vargas's desk with a note saying that I had a family emergency and could not continue. He tried to contact me for weeks, offering me more pay, flexible hours, anything to get me back. I never responded. I have followed the news about the museum since then. The idol is still on display, and I have noticed something interesting. Every few months, there is a new story about some problem. A security guard who quit without explanation. A curator who had a nervous breakdown. A visitor who collapsed in front of the idol's display case and was taken to the hospital. And 6 months ago, there was a darker piece of news. An archaeology student who was interning at the museum disappeared. He was last seen on the 3rd floor in the Chavin gallery late at night. His body was never found. The case remains unsolved. The police have no leads. The museum has intensified security, but they still have no answers. I have my suspicions. I believe the devourer finally found someone less strong, less skeptical, more vulnerable to its promises of power. Someone who accepted the pact that I rejected. And now, there is a new priest serving a 2,000-year-old stone god in the heart of modern Lima, performing ancient rituals in secret, feeding the devourer with sacrifices that no one notices because the modern world does not believe in these things. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done more, if I should have tried to destroy the idol, warn the museum, something. But who would have believed me? And what could I do against something that has existed and accumulated power for millennia? What I did do was change my career. I no longer study archaeology. Now I study the history of comparative religions, specifically the psychological aspects of belief systems. It's my way of understanding what I experienced without having to face it directly again. But I know the truth. I know that there are things in museums around the world that are more than mere artifacts. They are anchors for ancient entities, for pacts that transcend time, for powers that modern civilization has forgotten but not eliminated. And I know that every night, on the 3rd floor of the Museum of Ancestral Cultures in Lima, shadow figures kneel before a glass display case, singing in dead tongues, feeding something that should never have been unearthed. The devourer is still hungry, and now it has a new priest to satisfy that hunger. I can only hope that whoever accepted the pact eventually understands what I came to realize, that serving these ancient forces does not bring true power, only eternal slavery. But by then, it will probably be too late. The pact will have been renewed, and the cycle will continue for another 1,000 years. That's all Andres wanted to share about his experience. He told me he still has nightmares about the idol and completely avoids museums now, even during the day. If you have ever worked in museums, archives, or ancient collections and felt that certain objects have a presence of their own, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes what we preserve from the past includes more than history. Rest well. See you soon. I received this account from a follower named Fernando, who works as a maintenance technician in the Buenos Aires subway. What he found in an abandoned tunnel during an emergency repair made him resign after 15 years in the same position. If you have ever worked in underground tunnels or places below ground and felt that there are sections where you simply shouldn't be, share it below. This is Fernando's story and what he discovered in the forgotten depths of the subway. My name is Fernando, and for 15 years I worked as a maintenance technician in the Buenos Aires subway system. It was a stable job, well paid, with good benefits. I knew every tunnel, every abandoned station, every corner of the underground maze that extends beneath the city. Or at least I thought I did. What I am going to tell happened 4 months ago, during the night shift on April 13th. That night changed everything I thought I knew about the subway, about Buenos Aires, and about what really exists beneath our feet. The Buenos Aires subway has over 100 years of history. Line A, the first, opened in 1913, but what many don't know is that there are entire sections that have been closed, sealed, forgotten. Tunnels that were excavated but never used, stations that were planned but never completed. A ghost world beneath the real world. As a night maintenance technician, my job was to respond to emergencies when the train stopped running between 1 and 5 in the morning. That night, I received a call about an electrical problem on Line A, between the Peru and Piedras stations. Something was interfering with the systems, causing intermittent blackouts. I took my equipment and went down to the tunnel. My partner that night was Gabriel, a young guy who had only been on the job for 6 months. We walked through the main tunnel with our flashlights, following the cables until we found the point where the readings showed the anomaly. "It's around here," I said, checking my meter. "There's a massive voltage drop, as if something is draining energy from the system." Gabriel illuminated the walls of the tunnel. "Do you see that?" I followed his light. On the tunnel wall, almost hidden behind decades of grime, there was a metal door. It wasn't on any of the plans I knew. "Strange," I murmured. "I've never seen this door before." We approached. The door was old, the metal rusted and covered with a greenish patina. But the strangest thing was that it was slightly ajar, as if someone had opened it recently, and from the opening came a smell. Damp earth mixed with something sweet and rotten. "Should we check inside?" Gabriel asked, his voice betraying nervousness. "We need to find the source of the electrical problem," I replied, "and my readings indicate it comes from there." I pushed the door, which creaked open, echoing in the tunnel. Behind it was a staircase descending deeper, carved into the living rock. The walls were damp, covered in moss and fungi that glowed faintly in the darkness. "This isn't on any official plans," I said. "It must be from when they were doing the original excavations, probably an exploratory tunnel that was never used." We began to descend. The stairs were steep and uneven, clearly not made for regular use. The air grew denser, harder to breathe with each step, and the smell worsened. After what seemed like 100 steps, we arrived at a horizontal tunnel. It was different from the subway tunnels. This one was older. The walls were not modern concrete, but ancient stone, and the construction techniques seemed from another era. The 19th century, perhaps earlier. "Fernando, I don't like this," Gabriel said. "We should go back and report it." But my professional curiosity was already activated. "Just a little further. I need to see where that energy drop is coming from." The tunnel extended straight ahead, gradually descending. The walls were marked with symbols I didn't recognize. They were not modern graffiti. They were ancient carvings, worn by time but still visible. Some seemed religious, crosses and stars. Others were stranger, impossible geometries that made your eyes hurt to look at them. After walking about 200 meters, the tunnel opened into a large chamber. It was a circular area, perhaps 20 meters in diameter, with a vaulted ceiling. And in the center, there was something that made both Gabriel and me stop dead in our tracks. It was a structure. It looked like an altar or a monument, built with stones that did not match anything in the local geology. Black polished stones arranged in a circular pattern. And in the center of the circle, suspended in a way I couldn't understand, there was a shining object. It appeared to be made of metal, perhaps gold or bronze, in the shape of an irregular sphere covered in inscriptions. And it pulsed with its own light, a sickly bluish glow that faintly illuminated the chamber. "What the hell is that?" Gabriel whispered. I approached cautiously, my electric meter in hand. The readings went crazy. The object was emitting some kind of intense electromagnetic field. That explained the electrical interference in the subway above. It's some kind of artifact, I said, but I don't know what era or purpose. Around the chamber there were other objects. Rotten wooden boxes that crumbled at the touch. Rolled up scrolls that turned to dust when I tried to touch them. And bones. Many bones. Human, scattered around the altar as if they had been deliberately left there. Fernando, we need to leave. Now, Gabriel said urgently. But before I could respond, we heard something. A sound coming from deeper in the chamber, from a tunnel we hadn't noticed before, hidden in the shadows. Footsteps, slow, dragging, approaching. Our flashlights turned toward the sound. And what we saw emerging from that dark tunnel made my blood run cold. It was a humanoid figure, but completely wrong. It moved on 4 legs, but its limbs were bent at angles that no human joint would allow. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, showing dark veins underneath. And its head was turned backward, looking at where it had been instead of where it was going. When it spoke, its voice was multiple, as if several people were speaking at the same time in different tones. Intruders, invaders of the sanctuary, you must stay. Gabriel and I recoiled, our backs hitting the altar. The creature continued to approach, moving with a horrible grace that defied all physical logic. What is that? I managed to ask, my voice barely working. Guardian, the thing replied. Protector of the sacred, custodian of the seals. They have come. Now you must stay. Other shapes began to emerge from the surrounding tunnels. More creatures like the first. 5, 10, 20 of them, all moving with that same unnatural shape. And as they approached, they sang something in a language I didn't recognize, words that sounded like bones breaking and metal scraping stone. Run! I shouted to Gabriel. We ran towards the stairs we had come down. The creatures followed us, but they were slow, clumsy in their movements despite their agile appearance. We stumbled up the stairs, our flashlights swinging wildly, casting crazy shadows on the walls. Behind us, the singing continued, growing in volume and intensity. And I felt something else. A pressure in my mind, as if something were trying to invade my thoughts, planting ideas that weren't mine. We reached the subway tunnel and ran towards the nearest station. We didn't stop until we were on the surface, gasping under the streetlights at 3 in the morning. What was that? Gabriel breathed heavily, his eyes wild with terror. I don't know, I said. But we need to report it. There's something down there. Something that shouldn't exist. But when we tried to report what we had seen to our supervisor, they looked at us as if we were crazy. They said there were no unmapped tunnels in that section, that the door we described didn't exist, that we had obviously been exposed to toxic gases in the tunnels and had shared hallucinations. They sent us for a medical evaluation. The doctors found nothing wrong except elevated stress levels. They gave us a few days off and told us to come back when we were recovered. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't leave it at that. During my free time, I investigated. I searched through historical archives, old libraries, anything that could explain what lay beneath the subway. What I found was disturbing. It turns out that Buenos Aires was built over what was once a network of natural and artificial tunnels. Some dated back to the colonial era, used by smugglers and the church. Others were even older, created by pre-Columbian indigenous cultures. And I found references to something called the Sanctuary of the Eternals. According to fragmented documents from the 18th century, it was a place where a secret society performed forbidden rituals. Rituals designed to preserve life beyond natural death, to create immortal guardians who would protect their secrets forever. The society was eventually persecuted by the Inquisition and colonial authorities. Its members were executed, but before their capture, they sealed their sanctuary, leaving behind the guardians, people who had been transformed by the rituals into something more and less than human. The documents were vague, probably deliberately so, but they mentioned that the sanctuary was never found, that it remained hidden beneath the city, waiting, and they warned that it should never be opened, that what had been sealed there must remain sealed forever. When I returned to work a week later, I asked my supervisor to show me the plans for that section of the tunnel. We went together, and I pointed out exactly where the metal door had been. There was nothing. The wall was solid, without marks, without signs that there had ever been an opening there. But when I touched the wall, I felt something, a faint pulse, like a very weak heartbeat, emanating from behind the concrete. "See?" said my supervisor. "There's nothing here. You had a gas-induced hallucination. It happens sometimes in the old tunnels." But I knew the truth. Someone had sealed that door again. Or maybe it had never been open in our normal world. Maybe Gabriel and I had momentarily crossed into something more, a layer of reality that normally remains separate from ours. Gabriel quit 2 days later. He told me he couldn't keep working underground, that every time he closed his eyes he saw those creatures moving in the darkness. The last time I spoke to him, he was planning to move to another country, as far away from Buenos Aires as possible. I tried to carry on. For 3 more months I continued working in the tunnels, but every night I could feel them, the guardians, moving in parallel tunnels just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the lights. And sometimes when the subway was particularly quiet in the early hours of the morning, I could hear that singing. Faint, distant, but unmistakably the same singing we had heard in that chamber. The breaking point came a month ago. I was doing a routine repair when I found marks on a wall of the tunnel. Marks that hadn't been there the previous week. They were symbols, the same symbols I had seen carved into the walls of that ancient tunnel. And beneath the symbols, written in what appeared to be dried blood, there was a message in Spanish. "We found them. We remember them. Soon we will return for what belongs to us." I quit that very night. I didn't wait for the notice period. I simply left my gear, exited the subway, and never returned. Now I work above ground, in an office building doing maintenance on air conditioning systems. It's boring, it's safe, and most importantly, it's in the sunlight. But sometimes when I'm alone in the basement of some building, checking generators or electrical systems, I hear something, a distant scratching, a whisper of multiple voices speaking in that impossible language. And it reminds me that what I found was not confined only to that chamber beneath the subway. It is beneath the entire city, a network of ancient tunnels, of secret societies, of forgotten rituals. And the guardians are still there, protecting their secrets, waiting. Buenos Aires is a beautiful city. During the day it is life and light, tango and art, history and culture. But at night, especially in the darkest hours before dawn, if you pay attention, you can hear them. Those who live in the depths, those who were transformed by forbidden rituals and left behind to protect what should never be found. The subway continues to operate normally. Millions of people use it every day, completely unaware of what lies beyond the walls of the tunnels, deeper than the trains ever reach. And maybe it's better this way. Maybe ignorance is a blessing. Because knowing what's down there, knowing that every time you go down to the subway you're passing just meters away from those things, that knowledge changes everything. I can't take the subway anymore. I can't even walk over the ventilation grates without feeling a shiver. Because I know there are eyes in the darkness looking up, deformed hands gripping bars, voices singing in dead languages. And I wonder how many other places like that exist. How many other cities have forgotten sanctuaries beneath their streets. How many other secret societies sealed their rituals and guardians in underground chambers, waiting for the day someone stumbles upon them. The answer, I suspect, is more than we want to know. The shiny object we saw, the one emitting that electromagnetic field. I never discovered what it was, but I've thought about it a lot since then. It was clearly the source of power for something. For the Guardians, to maintain the seal over something even worse? I don't know. What I do know is that the Buenos Aires subway has inexplicable electrical problems in that section several times a year. Technicians go, find some mundane reason, fix it. But the anomalies continue. Because the true source is never addressed. Because it is beyond the reach of modern technology. Beyond what the official plans recognize as existing. Sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by fleeing. If I should have insisted more on reporting what we found. If I should have forced the authorities to investigate, to permanently seal those tunnels, to destroy whatever is down there. But then I remember the warnings in the historical documents. It must never be opened. What is sealed must remain sealed. And I wonder if by having found it, by having crossed the threshold of that chamber, we have already done enough damage. Because since that night, the electrical problems in the subway have increased. The anomalies are more frequent. And I have heard rumors, whispers among former co-workers, of other technicians who have seen strange things in the tunnels. Shadows moving in incorrect ways. Sounds that shouldn't be there. As if what was sleeping beneath the city had been disturbed. As if the guardians were more active, more alert, preparing for something. I don't know what will come next. I don't know if the seals that keep those things contained are weakening, or if they are simply becoming bolder. But I know this. There is a world beneath ours. A world of darkness and ancient secrets. And the two realities are separated by membranes thinner than we believe. And sometimes in places like forgotten subway tunnels, those membranes become thin enough to cross, to see what normally remains hidden, to encounter those who guard secrets that modern humanity has forgotten. My advice, if you ever find a door that shouldn't be there, a tunnel that isn't on the blueprints, a chamber that smells of centuries of preserved darkness, don't enter. No matter how curious you are, no matter if it's your job to investigate. Turn your back, close the door if you can, and forget that you ever saw it. Because some mysteries exist for a reason. Some secrets were buried because unearthing them only brings darkness to the world you thought you knew. And once you have seen what lurks in the depths, you can never unsee it. You can never walk the streets of your city again without knowing what moves beneath your feet. You can never forget that civilization is just a thin layer over something much older, much darker. That is the burden I now carry. The knowledge I cannot share because no one would believe me. The certainty that beneath Buenos Aires, beneath the subway that transports millions, there are immortal guardians protecting a sanctuary of forgotten horrors. And they are waiting, always waiting. Thus concludes Fernando's testimony. He told me that moving to surface jobs helped him, but that he still completely avoids the subway system. If you have ever worked in tunnels, deep basements, or underground systems, and have encountered sections that just felt wrong, share it in the comments. Sometimes what we bury beneath our cities includes more than just cables and pipes. Sweet dreams, and we'll talk soon. There are stories that come with a particular calmness, almost as if the one writing them has already made peace with what they experienced. This is the case of Rodrigo, a photographer who wrote to me a few weeks ago, telling me what happened to him during a week in an abandoned mining town in the north. If you're hearing this for the first time and you like this kind of content, consider subscribing. We publish new stories regularly. But now, close your eyes if you want, get comfortable, and let me take you to that town where the wind drags dust from decades, and where Rodrigo discovered that some people do not know, or do not want to, that it is already time to leave. I have been a photographer since I was 22. Not the kind of photographer who does weddings or graduation portraits. Although in my early years I did everything to pay the rent. My passion has always been documentary photography. The places that are no longer in use. The spaces that time abandons but does not completely erase. Closed factories, emptied hospitals, towns that lost their reason to exist when the mine ran out or the road went another way. Those places have something that active cities do not have. A brutal honesty. They don't pretend anything. They show exactly what they are. I have been doing this for 20 years. I have slept in buildings without light, walked through corridors where the ceiling threatens to give in, spent nights in places that most people would instinctively avoid. I was never superstitious. I never believed in ghosts, in presences, in any of that. Abandoned places seem to me exactly what they are. Places. Stone, wood, metal, dust. Nothing more. What happened to me in Hierro Viejo changed that. Not entirely because I am a stubborn man and stubbornness has its advantages. But it changed something in me that I didn't know was there before. The absolute certainty that the world is exactly what I can measure and photograph. That certainty fractured in Hierro Viejo, and it has not fully closed again. I arrived in the town in October, with a week of free time and an informal assignment from an editor who wanted material for a book about northern mining. Hierro Viejo had been a fairly sizable mining town in its day, 3,000 or 4,000 inhabitants during its peak years, with its church, its school, its square, its market. When the mine closed in the 70s, people left in successive waves until perhaps 20 families remained, then 10, and then none. By the time I arrived, the last permanent resident had died almost 15 years earlier, or so I thought. The nearest active town was called San Damaso, about 40 minutes by road. There, I settled into the only available guest house, which was actually the large house of a lady named Doña Amparo, who rented out 2 rooms on the second floor to those in need. Doña Amparo was about 70 years old, with her white hair tied up, a domestic efficiency that brooked no discussion, and a permanent expression of someone who has seen enough of life not to be easily surprised. When I told her where I was going to photograph, she nodded without comment. Then, while handing me the key to the room, she added without looking up, "If you're going to stay late in the old town, come back before it gets dark." I asked her why. "The road gets bad at night," she said. "The stones, the holes. It's not advisable." It was a practical and reasonable answer. I accepted it as such. The next day I went to Hierro Viejo for the first time. The access was a dirt road that, after 20 minutes, turned into a path of 2 parallel tracks between dry grass. The northern dust rose with every movement, covered the windshield, and got into the crevices. When I got out of the car and walked the last 100 meters to the edge of the village, the wind carried that dust in cold gusts that stuck to my clothes and hair. The village spread out in a hollow surrounded by bare hills. From above, you could see the entire layout. The main street in the center, the secondary streets branching out to the sides, the church in the background with its incomplete tower, the black mouths of some abandoned mines in the surrounding hills. Everything in ochre and gray tones, the color of things that the sun and dust have been erasing for decades. It was exactly the kind of place I love to photograph. I spent that first day exploring, without shooting much, just walking and looking. I like to get to know a place before I start photographing it, letting my eyes get accustomed to its particular geometry. The half-collapsed adobe houses, the empty windows framing the sky like photographs within photographs, the church floor covered with dead pigeons and fallen branches, the rusty rails that came out of the main entrance of the mine and disappeared up the hill. I returned to San Damaso before sunset, as Doña Amparo had said. On the second day, I brought all the equipment and started working seriously. The northern light in October has a particular quality, harsh and direct in the central hours, but with a strange warmth in the early morning and late afternoon that makes the abandoned surfaces seem almost alive. I had been photographing for hours, moving from one structure to another, lost in that state of total concentration which is the only way I know how to work well. It was that afternoon while photographing the interior of the church, when I noticed something strange in the viewfinder. It was framed in the main altar, a pile of splintered wood and fallen plaster that still retained remnants of golden paint. Light streamed in obliquely through the side windows, creating stripes of light and shadow over the debris. A perfect composition. But in the viewfinder, in the right corner of the frame, there was something that shouldn't be there. A figure, or something that looked like a figure. A dark, vertical shape, in the threshold of what had been the sacristy. I saw it clearly in the viewfinder for perhaps 2 seconds, and then nothing. I lowered the camera and looked directly at the threshold. Empty, just shadow and dust. I raised the camera again. The threshold in the viewfinder was empty. I archived it as a game of shadows, the kind of things that the tired eye builds in spaces with irregular light. I kept photographing, but I shot a series of frames towards that threshold just in case. That night, reviewing the images on the laptop screen, I enlarged the shots of the interior of the church. In most of them, the threshold of the sacristy was empty, as it should be. But in one image, the one I took exactly when I saw the figure in the viewfinder, there was something. It was not a clear figure. It was rather a different density in the shadow, a concentration of darkness that had a certain vertical shape. It could have been anything. A fallen beam, a buildup of dust, an effect of the camera sensor with that particular light. It could have been. I saved it and continued reviewing the other images. On the third day, I took a guide. Not because I needed him for orientation, but because I wanted to access the mines, and doing it alone seemed genuinely reckless. Felipe was a man in his 50s from San Damaso, who had known Hierro Viejo since he was young, when there was still some activity in the last mines before the final closure. He was quiet, few words, with that economy of expression of people who live in places where silence is the norm. We climbed to the main mine along the rusty rails. The interior was everything I expected and more. Stone walls with mineral veins that glimmered faintly in the light of the helmets. Wooden beams that time had made fragile as paper. Forgotten tools that rust had turned into abstract sculptures. I was photographing for hours, completely absorbed. Felipe accompanied me at a prudent distance, not getting into the frames, speaking only when he warned me of something structurally dangerous. At one moment, while I was photographing a side gallery that sank into darkness, Felipe approached me and said quietly, "Let's not go any further in that direction." I asked him why. "That branch is the oldest. There was a collapse a long time ago." He paused. "Several died." I asked him how many. 11, I think, or 13. The records from that time weren't accurate. Felipe looked into the darkness of the branch with no particular expression. They never got them out. The collapse was very deep. They stayed inside. I slowly lowered the camera. They stayed inside. I repeated, "Are their bodies still there?" "Yes." I stared at the darkness of the branch for a moment. Then I asked, "When was that?" 1948 or 49, before I was born. Felipe shrugged. "The people in the village remember them. There's a list of names in the church, or there was. I don't know if it's still there." We returned to the church in the afternoon. The plaque was still there, on the side wall, a corroded metal plate with 13 names engraved. I read them one by one with the flashlight. Common names, names from the north, names that had belonged to real people who, on a day in 1948 or 1949, entered that mine and did not come out. I photographed the plaque, and while I did, with the cold of the abandoned church in my fingers and the wind coming through the broken windows, I felt something that I couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't exactly fear, it was more of a feeling of being watched, not in a threatening way. Just the impression that something in that space was paying attention to my presence. I ignored it, or I tried to. That night I told Felipe, while we were having dinner in San Damaso, about the figure I had seen in the viewer the day before. Felipe listened to me without changing his expression. Then he said, "In the sacristy?" At the threshold of what was the sacristy, yes. He nodded slowly. The priest who was here when the town still had people said that sometimes he saw things in that church. Felipe took his coffee. After the collapse, some of the miners were very devout. Their families went to church to pray for them, who were still inside, without a Christian burial. He paused. Maybe some of them went too. He said it with the same calmness with which he had said everything else, as information, not as drama. On the fourth day, I went alone to Hierro Viejo. I wanted to spend the whole day in the church and the nearby streets. There was something in the light of that place that I had not finished capturing. Something in the way the afternoon fell on the facades and turned the color of the adobe into something almost alive. I arrived early, before the sun was high, and began to work methodically. I spent the morning outside, in the streets, in the yards of the collapsed houses. The wind was constant and carried that northern dust that gets into everything. I entered the church after noon. The light at 2 in the afternoon inside was completely different from that of the morning or the evening. Harder, without the warmth of the extreme hours, but with a clarity that allowed seeing details that were lost at other times. The faded frescoes on the walls, the cracks in the ceiling that let in strips of sky, the uneven floor where the tiles had given way. I had been working for a couple of hours, moving slowly, changing angles, waiting for the exact light before shooting. And then I saw her. Not in the viewfinder this time. Directly, with my eyes, without the mediation of any equipment. I was at the threshold of the sacristy, exactly where I had seen her before. A figure of a man, standing still, dressed in work clothes, dark pants, a shirt, boots with gaiters like those used in the mines decades ago. I couldn't see his face clearly because the light from behind cast him in shadow, but the figure was unmistakably human in its posture, in its proportion, in the way it seemed to be simply standing and looking at me. I remained completely motionless. My first reaction, the first, was to think it was a real person, that there was someone else in the village, perhaps an explorer, or a curious person who had arrived on their own and was also photographing or visiting the place. It was the logical explanation, and I clung to it for several seconds. But the several seconds passed, and the figure did not move. It made no gesture. It did not speak. I was simply standing in that threshold with a stillness that is not the stillness of a person waiting, but the stillness of something that has stopped needing to move. I slowly raised the camera and pointed it at the threshold. In the viewfinder, the figure was there. I shot, and at the moment I shot, the figure disappeared. It did not walk, it did not move. It simply ceased to be. I stood there with the camera in my hands, looking at the empty threshold, for what seemed like several minutes. My heart was pounding with a force that had no rational justification for the situation, and that alone, that racing heart, told me something that my mind was still trying to reject. I walked to the threshold of the sacristy. I entered. The room was small with a boarded-up window, the floor covered in debris, shelves fallen against the walls. There was no one. There was nowhere a person could have hidden in the second between when I shot and when I got there. I returned to the main ship of the church, picked up my equipment, and left. I sat on the steps of the entrance with the afternoon sun on my face and the dry wind from the north and tried to organize what had just happened. I am a methodical man. I am a man who works with images and knows what eyes and cameras do with light in certain spaces. I had a list of possible explanations and went through them one by one. None convinced me. That night in Doña Amparo's room, I reviewed the images from the day. The shot I had taken at the moment I saw the figure was one of the best of the week. The perfect light, the perfect framing, the composition I had been looking for, the threshold of the sacristy in the background, framed by the perspective of the nave. And on the threshold, a density, a shape. Not as clear as what I had seen with my own eyes, but defined enough for anyone looking at it to say, there is something there. I enlarged it to the maximum. Pixels, digital noise, the limits of resolution. But even so, even with the image broken down into its minimal units, there was something at that threshold that had the shape of a person. I saved the image and turned off the laptop. The next morning I had breakfast early, and before leaving I told Doña Amparo what I had seen. Not because I needed her validation, but because something in me needed to tell someone who knew the place. She listened to me without interrupting, her hands on the coffee cup, and when I finished, she nodded in a way that didn't surprise me, as if she already knew. "In the church?" she asked. "Yes, at the threshold of the sacristy. My mother told me that this happened." Doña Amparo didn't lift her gaze from her cup. When the town still had people, some said that sometimes in the church one could see one of the miners from the collapse. Always the same one. No one knew which of the 13 it was. She paused. My mother said it wasn't something to be scared of, that he was just there, that he never did anything to anyone. "Do you know why he's in the church?" I asked. "If he died in the mine." Doña Amparo thought for a moment. My mother said he was the youngest, that he was 16 or 17 years old, that he was very devout, went to mass every day. She looked up and met my gaze. "Maybe that's the only place he knows he can be." I remained silent, processing that. "And the others? The other 12? In the mine, I suppose." Doña Amparo shrugged with a calmness that only those who have lived with a certain idea their whole life possess. "Everyone stays where they can. On the 5th day, I returned to Hierro Viejo. I know it may seem like a strange decision after what I had experienced, but I am a photographer, and what I had seen the day before was, in a way I still didn't know how to articulate, the most important image I had made in 20 years. I couldn't leave without understanding what I was photographing. I arrived at the church mid-morning. I entered slowly, allowing my eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The main nave was empty and silent. The threshold of the sacristy was empty as well. I placed my equipment on the ground and sat on what remained of one of the benches, facing the altar. I didn't shoot anything. I just sat in silence. I don't know exactly how long I was like that. An hour, maybe more. The wind outside, the occasional creak of the wood under the midday heat, the pigeons on the roof, and then, without drama, without prior signal, the figure was back in the doorway. The same posture, the same stillness, the same work clothes from another time. This time I didn't lift the camera. I sat still and looked directly at her, with the same calm with which she, or he, looked at me. I don't know how long that lasted. Probably less than it seemed. And at some point, not knowing exactly why I did it, I said aloud, in the silence of that abandoned church, "You can leave now. You've been here too long." I said it like one says something when one doesn't know if it makes sense to say it, but something in oneself insists that it does. Without drama, without fear now, simply as one tells something to someone who needs to hear it. The figure in the doorway didn't move, but something in the church changed. A subtle variation in the quality of silence, like when someone opens a window in a closed room and the air moves for the first time, and then the figure was gone. This time it didn't disappear suddenly. It left gradually, like smoke when the wind carries it away, so slowly that I couldn't identify the exact moment when the threshold was definitively empty. I sat there for another 10 minutes on that bench, in silence, listening to the wind and the pigeons and the creaking of the old wood. Then I gathered my equipment and left. I spent the rest of the day photographing the outside of the village, the streets, the hills around, the mouths of the mind seen from afar. I didn't go back into the church. That afternoon, back in San Damaso, I stopped by Felipe's house and told him what had happened. He listened to me in the same way he listened to everything, without surprise, without disbelief, with that calm attention of someone who accepts that the world has more layers than one can see at first glance. When I finished, he said, "Do you think he left?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "I think something changed. Whether that means leaving or not, I have no way of knowing." Felipe nodded. "Sometimes it's enough for someone to say it," he said. "For someone to notice and say it out loud. For someone to acknowledge that they've been there too long." He paused. 16 years. No one ever came to look for them. The town emptied out and left them alone. I kept thinking about that. 13 people dead in a mine in 1948, in a town that emptied until no one was left to remember them. And one of them, the youngest, going every day to the only church he knew because it was the only place he knew he could be. On the 6th and 7th day, I finished the work. I photographed what I was missing, reviewed all the material, did the work of sorting and editing. I returned to the church one last time, on the final day, to take some shots of the plaque with the names. The threshold of the sacristy was empty all that morning. I don't know if that means anything or not. I don't know if what I saw was what I think it was, or if it was something my mind constructed with the help of the story Felipe had told me, and the particular quality of the light in those spaces. I am a photographer, not a paranormal investigator, and I have too much respect for intellectual honesty to claim more than I can know. What I do know is this: I have a photograph, an image of that threshold with something inside that shouldn't be there. And when I look at it, I don't feel what I feel when I look at a technical anomaly or a light effect. I feel something else, something that doesn't have a precise name but that I now recognize as real. The image is in the book published by the editor. It appears on page 74 without a caption explaining what it shows, just the threshold of a sacristy in an abandoned village in the north, with something in the shadow that has the shape of a person. So far, no one has asked me what it is, and I don't know what I would answer if they did. End of Rodrigo's story. He told me that the book sold well, that several readers wrote to him asking about that specific photograph on page 74, and that he replied the same to all. That it was a light effect. That he doesn't know if they believe him. I found it a story that speaks of something beyond fear, of the loneliness of those who are left behind, and what it means for someone to finally notice them. If you felt something from this story, I would like to read it in the comments. And if you have your own story that you want to share, you know where to find me. Sleep well. We'll talk in the next one.